So last class we looked at the loading world stuff. So we found out all about loading a Goomba and then making the class as well. So we did the class stuff, and I think we got as far as the constructor, but then that just makes enemies appear in the world, and they're really just fancy F boxes. So there's not a lot of excitement going on. So the next part of the story is making the behavior functions so that they actually move. And then the last thing is we actually have to call those from somewhere. So that's going to be this other tab, this update enemies tab over here, which will become exactly like update terrain. So that'll be good. So to start with, to give our Goombas legs, I added on some extra functions. So here's the move function. And this is going to make use of the direction variable. So direction is just either positive 1 or negative 1. So if I set velocity of speed times direction, it'll either go, leg speed is 50, so it'll be 50 or negative 50. And then I just let the y velocity sort of self-determine itself. So then all the gravity physics and stuff will be determined by Physica. We won't set it at all. If you wanted to make like bullet bill or something, then you could set that to something like set it to 0, so it would always kind of be horizontal, or set it to a negative number, so it always kind of flies up into the air or something. But if you want it to be able to fall off of things and stuff, then that's a good way to do it. And then we have this stuff here. So basically, it's just going to keep moving in its direction. And then if it ever touches a wall or another Goomba, then it's going to flip its direction. And we have to do this little hack where we set its position just slightly in one direction or another direction, just to get it so that it doesn't contact again. Because what will happen is we'll have more than one contact. So we'll flip direction once and then twice. And it'll be like we never flipped it in the first place. So just to make sure we don't have a double contact, we'll just nudge it right off of the block it touched. So this is not a function that exists in processing or Physica. We're going to write that, and it's actually really easy to do. This is something you'll be able to use for all the enemies. You could just see if like this enemy is touching like whatever name you want to give it, and I'll just figure it out. So that's pretty easy to take a look at. So that's good. So that's move. Any questions about that so far? Make sense? Well, that's fine. Cool. So now we have the touching function. So the story of this one, it's some extra complicated stuff, so let me just go over it. First of all, it's a Boolean function, not a void function. So all that means is that we can put that function into like an if statements conditional section or a while loops conditional section, because this will either be true or false. And the way that we answer the question is by returning true or returning false. And the idea is that we're going to use getContext. You guys remember getContext? So getContext is a function that we were using for the player for things like seeing if we're in the water. So over in update player, for example, we would use getContext to get all of the things that were touching player. And then we had a loop where we would go through all those contacts and just check, hey, was any of those things water? Because if they were, we're going to set touching water to true, and then our movement will be affected by that. So we had like an if-else statement lower down where it said, if touching water, move this way, else move the other way. That's not the touching water way. So that's sort of what getContext does. It gets a list of all the contacts that are touching whatever we call it from. And so in Goomba, if we just do getContext, whatever Goomba is being processed at that time, this will return a list of all of the things touching that Goomba. So what we want to do, oh yeah, go ahead.
So all the things, all the contacts that the Goomba is getting along with.
Yeah, exactly.
Simultaneously?
At that moment in time.
Oh, at that moment. Okay.
Yeah. So this method here, move, it'll happen every frame, and that we haven't seen that part yet of where that actually, like where we make move happen. So that's coming up. But when it does get called, which will be every frame, it'll check the list of things touching it at that frame, and that's what this function will do, get that list. And we'll call that contacts. We'll just save it to
at next frame, it will refresh it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And we don't see that mechanism yet, but I'll show you how to do that. There'll be an automated way of doing it, which is exactly like update terrain. But we'll see that in a second. So now unfortunately, I have this as a for each loop, which, unless you're in AP Computer Science, you don't know about too much. It's quite a convenient format, but I'll just show you what it would look like if we made this a while loop. So basically, we just need to loop through that list of contacts and check to see if any of them involve a Goomba and whatever thing we sent it, right? So whatever thing we sent it, so wall, for example, or Goomba, like we could send it anything. We're just going to call it thing over here on this side. So whatever gets sent, we'll just call it thing. So we're just checking to see if there's a contact between a Goomba and whatever thing we sent it. So as a while loop, oh, go ahead, Paul.
It definitely contains a Goomba, right?
Yeah, all of these will contain Goomba because we're getting contacts, and this is called from within the Goomba. So it's always going to be Goomba and something else, or whatever it is you named your enemy. If you didn't name it Goomba, then you use that name instead.
Oh, can you put only one thing in this?
No, unfortunately not. But it's not a big deal. You just type in
Yeah.
whatever you set your name to. So you probably did that up here in your constructor. So whatever your name is there, just put that as one of your parameters. The other one can just be the thing, whatever it is that got set. So as a while loop, this while loop looks exactly like the update player while loop. It's just a bit uglier, right? The for each loop just makes the index invisible. So when we're dealing with an array or an array list, we have to use an index, right? All the things have a number starting with 0, and we have to set it I to 0 here. And then, as long as I is less than the size of the thing, get the contact at position, 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, and then I++ to go to the next one. This is something you guys have seen a lot of. So the for each loop just, it recognizes that, this happens every single time you write a loop. Like almost every loop you write is the same thing over and over again. So let's just not do it. Let's just assume that you're going to do that. And what it does is, instead of using indexes, it just assumes you're going to start at the beginning, and it assumes you want to end when you get to the end. And instead of using the get function to get a contact, you do this here. And the way this is pronounced is for each or F contact, I guess is the name of it, in the contacts list, do this with it. And you can, whatever code you want to put in here. So in other words, instead of us using contacts.getI and setting C to that, it just automatically happens. C is always the current contact. And it always starts at the beginning, it always ends at the end, it always goes up by 1 each time. So the for each loop just automatically makes it happen. And then we can just ask each time, hey, does C contain a collision between a Goomba and a thing? Because if it does, the answer to the question of whether I'm touching a thing or not is true. And the way you answer a question in a function that returns true or false is to just return true. This ends the loop, by the way. This is the end of this function as soon as it returns true. So then, if for some reason we get to the end of this loop and we haven't returned true yet, we've looked at all the contexts. I guess there was no collision between a Goomba and a thing, so we can just automatically return false. Because if we got here, then we never returned true, so then this must be false. So we can just automatically assume that.
So as long as it returns a boolean, true or false.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. If we didn't return true, it would complain. It would say, hey, you promised to return a Boolean value, buddy. Where's your Boolean value? So you do have to return true or false. So if we never return true in this loop, well, I guess we weren't touching it. So we would just return false automatically.
Oh, I know that this is named contacts, and in update player there's another array list called contacts.
Yeah, that's okay because they are defined in separate methods. So if you define a variable in this method and you define a variable in this method, then they're separate. So they can have the same name.
They're local variables.
Exactly. They only exist inside of this function. Did I say method? I'm getting my AP mixed up. So yeah, so within this function, contacts is this thing. Within this function over here, contacts is this other thing. I like to use the word contacts so wherever I go, and that way I know what it is. It's sort of consistent everywhere, but they won't conflict. The only reason why they might conflict is if you also made a contacts array list up here in the first tab in this space up here. So just don't bother doing that and you'll be fine. So that's basically how the rest of that function works. And then this will just work the way you expect it to. And of course this wall thing, that's going to be your signaling terrain. It's exactly like your ground, but has a different name. Do you guys remember that? We talked about that last class? That's not going to be in the YouTube video. Sorry, YouTube. All you people watching. All you one people watching. So just to remind you, oh gosh, paint, there we go. The wall block, did I hit it? One more try. There we go. So the wall block is an identical block to the terrain, except that I gave it a different color so that when I load it, I know to give it a different name. So it'll have all the properties of these dark green ones, for visuals, all that stuff, but its name will be wall as opposed to ground. And then I can check for a collision with a wall. And maybe I should make these ones walls too, just in case it could jump or something. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, but that way these light green ones will signal the Goomba to turn around, and I can check for it if I hit a wall. If I just left them all as green, then I was checking to see if I was touching a ground. Well, I'm always touching a ground, so that's doesn't really help us to see if I hit a wall or not, right? So just by putting in these little signaling blocks, I can make my code a little bit more convenient. And also, I can check to see if I'm touching another Goomba, so I bounce off Goombas. So that's the story there. So is it starting to make sense how this class works?
Yeah.
Yeah? Good. So then the only thing that's missing from this picture is, well, how do you make them all move? Like, they have this function, but they're not just going to automatically move. You have to go and tell them to all to move. So just want to remind you that when we made our Goombas, we added them to the world, which is super important, because otherwise it won't show up. But then we also added them to an array list called enemies. It's very similar to the array list called terrain. And in fact, last year I just had everyone put them in the same array list, all the terrain and all the enemies. So we just had one loop. But it turned out that was really challenging because you had to keep all your code sort of in the same window, and people would break enemies and mess up terrain, and it was really confusing having all that code together. So this year I suggested everybody to have an update terrain function separate from an update enemies function. And then you can just work with the enemies here, and you can just forget about terrain for now. But they're functionally exactly the same. Like, they're going to have the same sort of stuff in them, just the update enemies will deal with the enemies. And here's what it looks like. It's just a while loop. I mean, it's exactly like update terrain. If you look at it, it's just the same while loop. Instead of going through terrain, update enemies goes through enemies. And then we get an F box. And then here's the only thing that's different and complicated. We have the I++ as well. We're just going through things. You'll have an if statement for each different enemy to trigger them to do their things. So you have, if enemy's name is thrower or assassin or whatever it is, like you'll have one for each type of enemy you make. But here's the complication. Goombas are not, they are F boxes, but they're a little bit different. So we have to change the syntax a little bit. And I'll show you what it looks like. Update enemies. So actually, this is what it's going to look like, but let me break it because it's not obvious. So this is sort of the way you'd want it to work. You get an enemy, and you check if its name is Goomba, then, well, they move. So that's what we do. Like, throwers will have other things that they do, and so on. So they move, so I call move. So if I run this, check out what happens. It's like, no, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because the move function doesn't exist. Wait, what? What is that? I wrote it right here. There's the move function. It clearly exists. So what's going on is that Goombas extend F boxes so they can go inside an array list of F boxes. But as far as we know here, enemy is just a plain old F box. It's not a Goomba because our array list is of F boxes. So you could say, well, I'll make this a Goomba. But then there's a problem there because you're going to have multiple types of enemies in that list. It's not always going to be a Goomba. But they're all based on F boxes. So you have to sort of get it as an F box. And then when you go to process it, go to make it do its things, that's when you can safely convert it to a Goomba. So at this point, you know it's a Goomba because its name is Goomba. So we do this thing called downcasting, which is just a fancy way of making sure that processing knows that what this is a Goomba, not just a plain old F box. Because we put this thing in a F box sort of can with a label that said F box on it. So, we can understand why it thinks should be an F box and it shouldn't be a move there. So we'll just clarify, oh, actually, you know what? This is actually a Goomba. Goomba. So what you do is you cast this thing, which is an F box, into a Goomba. It's just like taking the label F box off of this thing and replacing it with Goomba. So it knows that, in fact, it is a Goomba. And then you can call move from it. And then, I mean, if you want to take computer AP Comp Sci next year, then you'll see this as downcasting, and we'll go into more detail about that. But pretty much you can just do this for every single type of enemy and just cast it to thrower or assassin or whatever the name of your different classes are. And that'll just make sure it works. So if I run that, it'll do it, and this loop, of course, is happening every frame. So it's telling the Goombas every frame, move, 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 and they're getting to do their thing. So here's the Goombas. Oh, nice parkour handstand there. They're moving, they're bouncing off of each other, they're bouncing off the walls. You can bounce off anything you want, really. You can make that move function as complicated as you want. So yeah, and the only thing left to do is we don't die when they touch us. So there's some more stuff to think about there. But that's a really good solid basis for all of your enemies. Pretty much every enemy is going to have similar structure. You might add in additional functions. Like eventually I want to have the feet, pitter patter, so I'm going to have an animate function. You might have a throw function for something to throw something or shoot, or I don't know, whatever things you might have in there. So this is a great basis for all of your enemies. So I'll save this video, and you guys can get that in about 5 minutes. Well, 10 with school chat. Bye, YouTube.